Great cities have been erased from the map by forces far slower than war. The most important harbors in history did not always fall to armies or empires. They were defeated by the patient, grinding power of the earth itself. This is the story of harbors lost to silt, earthquakes, and shifting coastlines. By the end, you will understand the three invisible forces that have rewritten our world map and erased entire chapters of human connection. How does a bustling port simply vanish, leaving its ruins miles from the sea? What forgotten stories lie buried under mud or submerged beneath calm waters? These lost gateways hold profound clues about our fragile partnership with a dynamic planet. What do you think is the greatest threat to the coastal cities of today? The first and most patient of these forces is not fire or flood, but simple dirt. Rivers are the lifeblood of civilization, carrying fresh water and trade deep into continents. Yet that same flowing water carries a hidden cargo, millions of tiny particles of silt and sand. Every rainfall, every spring melt washes soil from mountains and fields, sending it on a one-way journey to the sea. Where the river finally meets the ocean, it slows down and drops its burden, grain by grain, year after year. Picture a bathtub with a slow, steady trickle of sand pouring into one end. Over time, the sand builds up, the water becomes shallower, and the usable space siltation, and for a harbor built at a river's mouth, it is a death sentence written in slow motion. The river's own delta, the very land it creates, begins to inch forward into the sea. What was once a deep, sheltered bay perfect for ships becomes a swamp, then a marsh, and finally dry land. The harbor is left stranded, sometimes miles inland from the new coastline. This transformation is so gradual it escapes notice within a single lifetime. A child playing on the docks sees the same water their grandparents saw. But across 10 generations, the change is total and irreversible. It is the silent killer of ports, a geographical fate sealed not by a dramatic event, but by the relentless, quiet accumulation of Earth itself. No ancient city better illustrates this slow drowning by land than Ephesus. Once among the greatest ports of the classical world, Ephesus was a glittering metropolis on the Aegean coast, a vital link between the empires of Greece and Rome and the riches of the East. Its deep-water harbor welcomed ships from across the Mediterranean, making it a hub of commerce, culture, and pilgrimage, famously home to the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders. The lifeblood of this maritime powerhouse was the Cayster River, flowing from the Anatolian highlands down to the sea, but the Cayster carried a hidden cost. With every flood and seasonal rain, it stripped soil from the hills and plains, transporting an immense, invisible freight of silt toward its mouth at Ephesus. For centuries, this process was manageable. Engineers dredged channels, and the city's wealth could fight back the encroaching land, yet the river's work never ceased. Grain by grain, the harbor basin grew shallower. The bay beyond the city began to shrink as the river's delta pushed stubbornly out into the Aegean. What were once open waterways became treacherous mudflats, then marshes buzzing with mosquitoes. The consequences were economic strangulation. Larger trading vessels could no longer reach the city's wharves. Goods had to be offloaded farther out and brought in by smaller, costlier boats. The smell of stagnant water and decay replaced the salt air. The very geography that made Ephesus wealthy was turning against it, not with a cataclysm, but with a patient, suffocating embrace. The city's leaders fought a desperate, losing battle against nature's slow agenda, spending fortunes on dredging projects that provided only temporary relief. Ephesus was being untethered from the sea, its reason for existence quietly buried under the land it had helped create. The struggle to save Ephesus reads like a chronicle of human determination against an unstoppable tide. For generations, the city's rulers, from the Greek general Lysimachus to a succession of Roman emperors, poured vast resources into a single Sisyphean task, keeping the harbor open. They became experts in fighting mud. Armies of workers, often slaves, would be deployed with shovels and baskets in massive dredging operations, physically hauling thousands of tons of wet, heavy silt from the harbor floor to deepen the channels. When dredging proved too temporary, they turned to grander feats of engineering, constructing long canals intended to divert the river's flow or flush the harbor clean with controlled water releases. Each project was a monumental effort, a declaration that human will could master the landscape, and each project for a time worked. Ships could sail in again, trade would surge, and the city would breathe a sigh of relief. But the Cayster River never stopped its work. Every storm in the hills, every plowed field in the hinterland, sent a fresh wave of sediment downstream. The sediment load was simply too immense, a natural process on a scale that no ancient technology could permanently halt. There's a profound irony here. The very source of Ephesus's wealth, the prosperous farms and settlements along the river that fed the city and supplied its trade, were also the source of its demise. Agricultural activity loosened the soil, making it easier for rain to wash it away. The city's success was literally digging its own grave, grain by grain. You can trace this losing battle in the archaeology. As the original harbor near the city center silted up into a malaria-ridden swamp, engineers were forced to construct a new basin further out, closer to the receding coastline. Then, as that too filled in, another one was built even further away. The city was stretching an arm out to a sea that was in constant retreat, each new harbor a shorter-lived lifeline than the last. The waterfront kept marching away from the heart of Ephesus, leaving behind abandoned wharves and warehouses that now stood in stagnant water, then damp earth, and finally, under fields where no ship would ever sail again. The final chapter for Ephesus was written not in stone but in mud. By the late centuries of the Byzantine Empire, the battle was definitively lost. The harbor that had once echoed with the shouts of sailors and the creak of ship timbers was now a silent, grassy field. The relentless advance of the Cayster River's delta had sealed the city off from the sea entirely, transforming a global port into a landlocked town. This geographical isolation was a death sentence for its economy. The trade routes that were its lifeblood simply bypassed it, flowing to newer, deeper ports along the coast. The wealth evaporated, the population dwindled, and the great city contracted into a small settlement clinging to the slopes around the aging church of St. John. What had been a cause of its birth became the reason for its abandonment. People finally left not because of an invasion, but because the water had gone, leaving behind a silence broken only by the wind in the reeds. Today, the magnificent ruins of Ephesus, its grand theater and marble-paved streets, sit in a flat, marshy plain several miles from the modern Aegean shoreline. Visitors walk through the skeleton of a maritime capital, now utterly divorced from the sea that created it. It stands as the perfect, sobering archetype of a harbor, lost not to a sudden cataclysm, but to the patient, inexorable accumulation of sediment, a story written in slow motion across 1,000 years. Yet the earth does not always work with such patience. Where siltation is a story told in centuries, the second force writes its chapters in minutes. Tectonic activity, the restless shifting of the planet's crust, can erase a harbor's destiny in a single, violent spasm. An earthquake delivers a catastrophic, multi-faceted blow. The immediate destruction is terrifyingly clear, shaking stone quays and warehouses into rubble, sending ships crashing against shattered docks. But the true, lasting devastation often lies in what the quake leaves behind, a fundamental change in the very landscape. The ground itself can drop, a process called subsidence, plunging wharves and city blocks permanently below the waterline, inviting the sea to flood in and claim them. Conversely, the land can lurch upward in an event known as uplift, hoisting a once busy harbour basin high and dry, leaving ships stranded on a new shelf of rock, impossibly far from the tide. This is not a slow drifting apart from the sea, but a sudden, brutal divorce. The relationship between the city and the water is rewritten in an instant by forces deep below that no engineer could ever hope to control. To understand this kind of transformation, we must look to a port that vanished not into mud, but into myth, a place whose fate was sealed not by a river's gift, but by the shudder of the planet. But for a stark contrast to Ephesus's slow decline, we must journey to the Caribbean, to a city whose end was as sudden and spectacular as its life was notorious. Port Royal, Jamaica, in the late 1600s, was not just a harbour, it was a phenomenon. Built on a long, narrow spit of sand at the entrance to Kingston Harbour, it was the richest and most wicked city in the English New World, a bustling, lawless haven for pirates, privateers, and merchants swimming in Spanish gold. They called it the Sodom of the West, the wickedest city on earth, a place where fortune and ruin walked hand in hand along its unstable shores, and that instability was literal. The entire city sat upon a foundation not of solid rock, but of loose sand and gravel, a geological gamble of the highest order. This setting made it a perfect deep water port, but it was a house built on the most treacherous of sands. The stage was set for a disaster that would be remembered not for its slow creep, but for its breathtaking, terrifying speed. Then, on the morning of June 7, 1692, the gamble was called. The earth beneath Port Royal did not simply shake, it transformed. In a series of violent convulsions, the solid ground turned to liquid. This process, called liquefaction, occurs when saturated, loose soil loses its strength during intense shaking, behaving like a fluid. The sand spit simply dissolved. Brick buildings, stone forts, and crowded wharves slid into the churning harbour as if they were sinking into a thick, hungry soup. In mere minutes, 2/3 of the city was swallowed by the sea or buried under landslides from the surrounding hills. The harbour itself was catastrophically reconfigured, with vast sections of the city now lying under 30 feet of water, while other areas were lifted permanently from the waves. A bustling pirate capital was erased from the map between one breath and the next, not by a rival navy, but by the fundamental betrayal of the very earth it stood upon. The morning of June 7th was like any other in that bustling port, until the world simply came apart. At 20 minutes before noon, the ground began to roar. A massive earthquake, estimated at a magnitude 7.5, struck directly beneath the city. The initial tremors were violent enough to topple stone structures, but the true horror followed seconds later. The very foundation of Port Royal, that waterlogged spit of sand, underwent a terrifying transformation. The intense shaking caused a phenomenon known as soil liquefaction. In simple terms, the vibration forced the tiny grains of saturated sand to separate, squeezing the water between them upward. In an instant, the solid ground lost all cohesion. It ceased to be earth and became a churning, unstable fluid. The city was not standing on sand anymore, it was floating on quicksand. Streets buckled and split open like seams, swallowing people and carts whole. Multi-story brick buildings, including the famed merchants' warehouses and taverns, tilted on their sides and then slid, almost gracefully, into the harbour. They sank remarkably intact, their contents frozen in a moment of catastrophic collapse. Within just 2 minutes, over 33 acres of the city, nearly 2/3 of its total area, had vanished beneath the waves or been buried by landslides from the surrounding bluffs. The geography was rewritten in a single, brutal act, where Ephesus saw its harbour slowly retreat, leaving the city stranded on dry land. Port Royal experienced the opposite fate. Here, the harbor did not abandon the city, it actively consumed it. The deep water port became a mass grave, entombing the wickedest city on earth in a sarcophagus of sand and seawater. This contrast is stark, one a story of patient suffocation, the other a tale of sudden, dramatic ingestion by the very element that gave it life. Port Royal did not simply vanish without a trace. In the chaotic days after the earthquake, survivors clung to the shattered remains of the spit, attempting to rebuild amid the rubble and the pervasive stench of loss. A smaller, more subdued settlement did rise from the wreckage, but its soul was gone. The city's reputation as a cursed, wicked place, now seemingly confirmed by divine judgment, haunted its memory. More practically, the geography had been permanently altered. The harbor entrance was reconfigured, and the instability of the ground was a terrifying, proven fact. Maritime commerce, always driven by efficiency and safety, began to shift just across the bay to the more stable shores of what would become Kingston. Within a generation, the new city of Kingston eclipsed Port Royal completely, inheriting its role as Jamaica's principal port and capital. The earthquake did more than destroy buildings, it shattered the very conditions that made the harbor viable, transferring regional power in a single, violent transaction. Yet in its drowning, Port Royal found a strange kind of immortality. The section of the city that slid into the sea was entombed in a unique environment. Layers of silt and sand quickly covered the ruins, creating an oxygen pore or anaerobic seal. This absence of oxygen dramatically slowed the decay of organic materials. Wooden structures, leather shoes, even fragile textiles and food remains were preserved in a state of remarkable freshness, as if frozen in the moment of their sinking. This transformed the disaster site into one of the world's most valuable underwater archaeological treasures, a perfectly preserved snapshot of 17th century colonial life in the Americas. Where Ephesus offers a skeleton on dry land, Port Royal provides a waterlogged time capsule, its streets and rooms still holding the everyday objects of its inhabitants. So we have seen two opposing forces, the slow, patient burial by silt and the sudden, catastrophic rearrangement by earthquake. But a third, even more subtle force remains, one that operates on a scale so vast it can be difficult to perceive within a human lifetime. This is the gradual, relentless movement of the coastline itself, a global process of advance and retreat driven by the memory of ice ages and the slow dance of tectonic plates. Entire stretches of shoreline can creep inland or extend seaward over centuries, not from a river's sediment or a seismic shock, but from the planet's own long-term rhythms. To find a harbor lost to this immense creeping tide, we must look to a legend, a city whose name is synonymous with swallowed kingdoms, a place that may have slipped beneath the waves not in a day but over 1,000 slow years. The story of coastlines is one of constant, quiet motion. Beyond the sudden violence of earthquakes and the patient accumulation of silt, there exists a third, even more profound force, one that operates on a scale so vast it can feel like the background hum of the planet itself. This is the long-term migration of the shoreline, a slow dance of advance and retreat driven by the deep memory of ice ages and the restless shifting of tectonic plates. A coastline is not a fixed line on a map, it is a dynamic and ever-moving zone, a frontier between land and sea that is always being negotiated. Over centuries, this zone can creep inland, swallowing beaches and settlements, or it can retreat seaward, exposing new land and leaving old ports high and dry. This grand, glacial pace of change often works in concert with the other forces we have seen, amplifying siltation or being triggered by tectonic uplift, but its primary driver is the global balance of water. When vast continental ice sheets melt, sea levels rise globally, drowning coastal plains. When water is locked away in ice during glacial periods, sea levels fall, exposing vast new shelves of land. A harbour built during a period of stable seas can find itself 1,000 years later either stranded miles inland on a newly exposed plain or completely submerged beneath the waves, its ruins resting on what is now the continental shelf. To find a harbour lost to this immense creeping tide, we must look beyond single events and consider legends born from this slow, inexorable process, places whose stories may be written not in a day but across 1,000 silent years. The North Sea holds a different kind of story, written not in sudden collapse or slow silt, but in a steady, hungry retreat. Along the eastern coast of England, in a region known as Holderness, the land itself is surrendering to the waves at one of the fastest rates in Europe. This is a coastline in constant, quiet recession, where the sea claims an average of 6.5 feet of land every single year. For over 1,000 years, this relentless erosion has been consuming towns, churches, and farmland, swallowing them whole into the cold waters. This process created a landscape of ghosts, where medieval villages that once thrived with their own small harbors and fishing fleets now exist only as names on old maps, their physical remains scattered on the seabed. Places like Ravenspurn, a significant port that once sheltered the royal fleet of King Henry IV, and Old Kilnsea with its church and homes, have completely vanished. Their loss was not a single dramatic event, but a creeping inevitability, a frontier of loss measured in generations. A farmer might notice his field was a little smaller after a winter storm. A family might have to abandon a cottage perched precariously on crumbling cliffs. The village harbour, the economic heart of the community, would become unusable as the protective coastline around it dissolved, exposing it to destructive waves. One by one, these settlements were abandoned, their residents moving further inland, only for the process to begin again decades later. The pace was just slow enough to be manageable for those living through it, yet absolutely certain over the long span of history. This is a loss dictated by the sheer softness of the land, layers of glacial clay and sand that offer little resistance to the North Sea's endless assault. Unlike Port Royal or Ephesus, there was no grand battle fought here, no massive engineering projects launched to save the harbors. The communities of Holderness witnessed a quieter truth, that sometimes the sea does not need a cataclysm to reclaim what was once land. It only needs patience and a soft, yielding shore. The evidence of this slow vanishing is written in fading ink and exposed stone. For generations, the people of these vanishing shores kept records of their retreat, not as a grand historical chronicle, but in the mundane documents of daily life. Parish registers note the relocation of churches. Property deeds describe fields that no longer exist. Old maps, drawn by coastal surveyors with quill and compass, show headlands, villages, and small harbors that have since been erased from the landscape. These maps become palimpsests of loss, where the cartographer's line marks a frontier that the sea had already begun to consume. Sometimes, the sea itself offers a glimpse of what it has taken. During the very lowest spring tides, when the water pulls back farther than usual, the foundations of lost villages are briefly revealed. Stumps of wooden pilings that once supported jetties, the cobbled stones of old streets, and the outlines of fish traps emerge from the sand and mud, glistening for a few hours before the tide returns to hide them again. These ghostly exposures are poignant reminders that the land under the waves was once lived upon, a tangible connection to communities that made their living from a shoreline that no longer exists. This type of loss is not a single, catastrophic event with a clear before and after. It is a continuous, grinding process of attrition. A family might rebuild their home a little farther inland after a bad storm. A whole village might collectively decide, over a generation, to move its entire footprint away from the crumbling cliffs. The harbor, the economic center, is often the first thing to go, becoming too dangerous or too shallow to use, forcing a change in how people live long before their homes are threatened. This case emphasizes a humbling truth. the immense power of gradual geomorphic processes over human settlement. Our towns and cities are often built on the assumption that the ground beneath them is stable and permanent. But coastlines like Holderness teach us that the Earth is in a constant, slow-motion negotiation with the ocean, and human communities are merely temporary participants in that conversation, always adapting, always retreating, writing their history on a shoreline that is itself a fleeting document. But to witness all three forces converge on a single, legendary harbor, we must sail to the Mediterranean coast of Egypt. Here stood Alexandria, a city that was more than a port. It was an idea made of marble and ambition. Founded by Alexander the Great himself, it was engineered to be the greatest city on earth, the intellectual and commercial capital of the Hellenistic world. Its heart was its harbor, a masterpiece of ancient engineering. It was protected by a long, curving causeway called the Heptastadion, which linked the mainland to the island of Pharos. And on that island stood its crowning glory, the Pharos Lighthouse, a structure so immense and ingenious it was counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Its great mirror could project a beam of fire visible from over 30 miles out to sea, a guiding star for every vessel sailing the Mediterranean. This harbor was not just a place for ships, it was the gateway to a global exchange of goods, ideas, and knowledge, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria. Yet its very location, on the dynamic edge of the Nile Delta, placed it directly in the path of the same relentless forces we have seen at work elsewhere. The city sat between 2 bodies of water, the open Mediterranean to the north and the vast freshwater lake Marotes to the south. This lake was itself connected by canals to the Nile, making Alexandria a unique double harbor, accessible from both the sea and the riverine network of Egypt. This brilliant design was also its profound geographical vulnerability, setting the stage for a slow-motion transformation that would take centuries to complete. Alexandria's harbor did not fall in a single dramatic moment. Its decline was a symphony of geological misfortunes, each movement playing out over centuries. The first and most persistent note was Silt. The city was positioned near the now vanished canopic branch of the Nile, one of the river's ancient distributaries that once emptied into the Mediterranean nearby. For generations, this branch delivered the life-giving water and fertile soil that sustained the region, but it also delivered a constant, slow trickle of sediment directly toward the harbor's entrance. Over hundreds of years, this relentless deposition began to choke the deep water channels. The process was invisible year to year, but across lifetimes, the harbor's depth diminished. The great basins where triremes and merchant galleys once docked grew shallower, transforming from deep blue to a murky green. This was Ephesus's story playing out on an Egyptian stage, a slow strangulation by the very river that fed the civilization. Yet the earth beneath Alexandria was also restless. The city sits near a major tectonic boundary where the African plate meets the Eurasian plate. This made it susceptible to powerful earthquakes throughout its history. Unlike the liquefaction that swallowed Port Royal, the seismic shocks here often caused a different phenomenon, subsidence. During major quakes, sections of the coastline, including the harbor floor, could suddenly drop by several feet. Imagine the entire waterfront, including the massive stone quays and breakwaters, lurching downward in an instant. Each subsidence event permanently lowered the land relative to the sea. This meant that after a quake, the same sea level now reached farther inland, flooding low-lying areas and making the harbor basins more vulnerable to wave action and, crucially, to the advancing silt. The subsidence also destabilized the monumental structures built upon the land. The foundations of the great lighthouse on Pharos Island, subjected to this repeated shaking and sinking, were gradually compromised. The final force was the most gradual of all, a global rise in sea level. Since the end of the last ice age, the world's oceans have been slowly climbing. In Alexandria, this meant the Mediterranean was, century by century, encroaching on the land. This rise, though measured in millimeters per year, compounded the effects of both the siltation and the subsidence. It helped push the Nile's sediment further into the harbor basins and amplified the flooding caused by seismic sinking. The synergy of these three forces was devastating. The silt shallowed the harbor, the earthquake sank its foundations and weakened its structures, and the rising sea provided the extra volume of water to flood the compromised areas. The famous Pharaoh's lighthouse, that wonder of the ancient world, stood as a symbol of this losing battle. Weakened by repeated seismic shocks and with its base potentially undermined by subsidence and encroaching water, it finally succumbed. A series of earthquakes between the 10th and 14th centuries reduced the towering guide to rubble, its great mirror and fire forever extinguished. By the late medieval period, the eastern harbor was a shadow of its former self. The deep basins where Cleopatra's fleet might have anchored were now largely impassable to all but the smallest fishing boats, transformed into a shallow, silt-choked lagoon. The greatest port of the classical world had been defeated not by an empire, but by the patient, collaborative work of earth, water, and time. For centuries, the fate of Alexandria's harbor was a story told only in crumbling texts and fading maps. Then, the murky waters of the eastern harbor began to give up their secrets. In the late 1990s, a team of underwater archaeologists led by the French explorer Franck Goddio began a systematic survey of the seabed off the modern city's shore. Using advanced sonar and satellite positioning technology, they did not just find scattered artifacts, they mapped an entire drowned world. Their scans revealed the ghostly outlines of ancient breakwaters, toppled columns, and the foundations of grand buildings, all lying in the silent, dark green water. This was not a shipwreck, it was a submerged district, a piece of the city's heart that had slipped beneath the waves. The team's meticulous work produced the first accurate cartography of the sunken royal quarters, the area known as the Portus Magnus, where the Ptolemaic kings once walked. It was a digital resurrection of a landscape lost for over a millennium, providing a physical, tangible map to a history that had only been theoretical. Here was the ultimate proof of the slow disaster, the harbor floor now holding the very palaces that were meant to oversee it. The sonar images showed how the ancient coastline had fractured and sunk, with structures lying at different depths, a clear testament to multiple episodes of seismic subsidence. The historical accounts of earthquakes and flooding were no longer just dramatic stories. They were etched into the seabed itself, a geological record of catastrophe written in stone and sand. The most striking discoveries were the objects that emerged from the silt, items that transformed the map into a living place. Divers brought to the surface colossal statues of pink granite, including a towering likeness of a Ptolemaic king and a magnificent queen believed to be Cleopatra VII. They found sphinxes, their enigmatic smiles now facing the filtered sunlight from above, and intricate ceremonial barges made of stone. They uncovered hundreds of everyday items, anchors, coins, pottery, and jewelry, all preserved in the oxygen-poor mud. Each find was a point of light illuminating the dark. A heavy stone block from a toppled pier, found far from where the ancient shoreline was thought to be, confirmed the land had sunk. The scattered remains of the legendary lighthouse, its massive blocks strewn across the harbor floor, marked the final resting place of the wonder. These were not isolated treasures, they were the furnishings of a drowned city, left exactly where they fell when the ground gave way or the water rose. The archaeology tells a story of gradual abandonment and repeated disaster. Some areas show orderly collapse, as if buildings were carefully taken apart for their stone. Others show violent, sudden ruin, with columns and statues lying in chaotic heaps, likely felled by a powerful quake. This layered evidence allows historians to piece together a timeline not of a single event, but of a prolonged retreat, a centuries-long negotiation with a sinking shore. The harbor did not vanish in a day. It faded section by section as the water claimed more and more of its streets and monuments. What the underwater map reveals is a profound geographical truth. The modern city of Alexandria is built largely on the accumulated silt and rubble of its own past, perched on a shoreline that has advanced seaward over the ruins. The ancient city's most important administrative and religious centers were not inland, as one might expect, but right on the dynamic waterfront. Goddio's team found the remains of the Temple of Isis on the sunken island of Anterodos, a place mentioned in ancient texts but whose location had been a mystery. They mapped the royal palaces extending on promontories into the harbor itself. This was a city that lived with and on the water, its power and identity inseparable from its port. The Subsidence did not just flood a few buildings, it erased the very stage upon which the drama of Hellenistic and Roman Egypt was performed. The physical evidence from the seabed allows us to understand the scale of the loss not in abstract terms but in human terms. We can trace the path of a sunken processional way, imagine the view from a now submerged palace window, and comprehend the immense logistical and economic blow of losing these deep water basins. The silent stones on the harbor floor speak louder than any historian's account, offering a direct, poignant connection to a world that was slowly reclaimed by the sea. They show us that the story of Alexandria's harbor is the story of a brilliant, ambitious partnership with a volatile coast, a partnership that the earth itself ultimately dissolved. The story of a harbor can be a record of unintended consequences. While earthquakes and shifting seas are forces beyond our control, there is a third, more intimate kind of loss, one where human hands unknowingly write the final chapter. This is the story of harbors that fell not just to nature, but to a feedback loop, where the very actions that built a civilization's wealth also set in motion the geological processes that would destroy its gateway to the world. To see this tragic synergy in action, we look to another luminary of the ancient Aegean, the great city of Miletus. In its prime, Miletus was a powerhouse of commerce and philosophy, a city so wealthy and influential it was known as the mother of colonies, founding dozens of settlements across the Black Sea and Mediterranean. Its strength lay in its unique geography. It was not built on a simple bay, but on a peninsula that reached out into a deep gulf, with no fewer than 4 separate harbors cradled along its shores. This gave it a tremendous advantage, allowing it to handle immense volumes of trade from every direction, sheltered from the worst of the weather. Its location at the mouth of the mighty Meander River connected it to the rich agricultural heartland of Anatolia. For centuries, this seemed like a perfect, unbreakable system, a marriage of human ingenuity and natural bounty. But that bounty came with a hidden, ticking clock, and the clock was powered by the very people who benefited from it. The prosperity of Miletus demanded more from the land. To feed its growing population and supply its ships, the forests and hills of its hinterland were steadily cleared for timber and for grazing land. Trees that once held the soil firmly in place with their roots were cut down. Goats and sheep grazing on the slopes cropped the stabilizing grasses down to the bare earth. With each passing season, the land became more vulnerable. When the rains came, as they always do, they now washed over exposed, loose soil with nothing to slow them down. This was not a gentle erosion, but a rapid stripping away of the very skin of the land, and all that soil, every grain of it, had a single destination. It was carried by countless streams into the waiting embrace of the Meander River. The river, once a clear artery of trade, began to thicken with a relentless, brown freight of silt. This was the city's own prosperity, quite literally washing away downstream. The harbor that was the source of its wealth was now being fed a slow, steady diet of its own undoing. The process was invisible to any one generation, a gradual change measured in the subtle shallowing of a channel, or the slow advance of reeds at the water's edge. But over centuries, the mathematics of this runoff became catastrophic. The meander, heavy with the soil of the eroded hills, deposited its load where the river met the sea, right at the head of the gulf that sheltered Miletus. Slowly, implacably, the gulf began to fill in. What was once open, deep blue water transformed into marshland, then into solid, fertile plain. The peninsula of Miletus, with its 4 proud harbours, was no longer a peninsula at all. It became a landlocked mound rising from a flat, agricultural field, its wharves stranded miles from the receding shoreline. The city that mastered the sea was defeated by the soil, a soil its own success had set free. The slow death of Miletus is a map written in mud. That relentless freight of silt from the Meander River did more than simply clog the city's harbours. It performed a geographical magic trick on a grand scale. The process is called progradation, where a coastline actively builds itself outward, seaward, as a river dumps more sediment than the waves can carry away. For Miletus, this meant the entire geography around it was in motion. The deep gulf that once cradled its 4 harbours began to shrink from the head inward, like a bathtub slowly filling with wet cement. Marsh grasses took root in the new shallows, then shrubs, and finally, over centuries, stable land. The silt built a new world, pushing the shoreline of the Aegean steadily, stubbornly, farther and farther to the west. The city's proud peninsula, once a strategic finger pointing into deep water, was left high and dry. It became an isolated mound, a lonely hill rising from a flat, featureless plain of rich alluvial soil, a plain that had not existed when the city was founded. You can stand on the ruins of the great theatre today and look out not over blue water, but over endless fields of cotton and wheat. The sea is a distant, shimmering line on the horizon, several miles away. This physical isolation was an economic death sentence. A maritime power cannot survive without a maritime reality. The deep-drafted merchant ships that were the source of its wealth could no longer reach the city at all. The intricate network of docks and warehouses became useless, then forgotten, buried under feet of fertile earth. The city's lifeblood, the flow of trade and ideas, was severed as completely as if it had been blockaded by a hostile fleet. Miletus dwindled from a metropolis that minted its own coins and founded colonies into a small, landlocked settlement, its people scratching a living from the very soil that had entombed their harbor. Its story is a profound lesson in unintended consequences. The city's spectacular wealth was built on trade, and that trade demanded agricultural surplus from its hinterland. To create that surplus, the forests were cleared and the hills were overgrazed. This deforestation unleashed the erosion that sent the silt downstream, which then filled the harbor and cut the city off from the trade that started the cycle. It was a devastating feedback loop where the pursuit of prosperity directly undermined the geographical foundation that made prosperity possible. The land won, but only after the people had unwittingly handed it the very tools for victory. The most profound lesson from these lost harbors may be that our own hands can accelerate the very forces that erase them. Human ambition, in its drive to master geography, often sets in motion chains of unintended consequences that unfold across centuries. This final case takes us to the edge of the Persian Gulf, to a port that was the ultimate expression of human control over a river, a city literally built by redirecting the flow of water to serve commerce. Its name was Charax Spasinu, and its story is not one of passive defeat by nature, but of a brilliant temporary victory that ultimately could not be sustained. Founded by Alexander the Great's successor, Antiochus IV, around 300 BC, Charax was strategically positioned at the critical head of the Persian Gulf, where the great rivers of Mesopotamia met the sea. This location was a nexus of global trade, where goods from India, Arabia, and the Mediterranean world converged. But the natural river mouths here were treacherous, silty, and prone to shifting, making reliable navigation for large ships a constant challenge. The founders of Charax did not accept this limitation. In an astonishing feat of ancient engineering, they did not simply build a city beside a river, they rebuilt the river to serve the city. They constructed an extensive artificial canal system, deliberately diverting and channeling the combined waters of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Charon rivers to create a stable, deep-water harbor where nature had offered only a dynamic, muddy delta. For a time, it worked spectacularly well. Charax Spasinu became the premier maritime gateway for the Parthian and later the Sasanian empires, a wealthy, fortified emporium where the riches of the East flowed ashore. The harbor was a masterpiece of human will, a testament to the belief that geography was not destiny but a problem to be solved. Yet the rivers of Mesopotamia have their own long memory and their own relentless logic. The very act of channeling and controlling them may have set the stage for the harbor's eventual abandonment. These are not tame, stable waterways. They carry immense sediment loads from the highlands of Turkey and Iran, and their courses across the flat alluvial plain have always been prone to dramatic, natural shifts. A major flood could breach a levee, and the river would simply choose a new path to the sea, abandoning its old channel. Human management, through canals and dikes, attempted to fix the rivers in place to force them into a predictable pattern. But this interference may have had a paradoxical effect. By constraining the flow and preventing the natural, widespread flooding that distributed silt across the floodplain, the sediment concentrated in the main artificial channels. This could have accelerated the siltation process right at the harbor's doorstep. Furthermore, maintaining such a vast, artificial hydrological system required a powerful, centralized authority and constant, labor-intensive dredging. As political power shifted and empires faced internal strife or external invasion, that maintenance inevitably faltered. The canals would begin to clog. The precise, engineered flow of water would slow and wander. The end for Charax Spasinu was a gradual strangulation by the landscape it had tried to command. Over several centuries, the combined effects of natural river avulsion and the decay of its human-made infrastructure transformed the region. The Tigris, Euphrates, and Charon rivers, responding to floods, seismic events, and the buildup of their own sediment, gradually shifted their courses away from the city's meticulously dug canals. The life-giving water that fed the harbor and flushed its channels began to dwindle, then stopped altogether. What was left behind was not the deep blue of a thriving port, but the stagnant green and brown of expanding marshland. The great harbor basins, cut off from the vigorous flow of fresh water, silted up completely. The docks that once welcomed ocean-going vessels now looked out over reeds and mudflats. The city, an island of stone in a softening world, was left high and dry, surrounded by a vast wetland that made overland travel difficult and maritime trade impossible. The economic rationale for its existence evaporated. By the time of the Arab conquests in the 7th century AD, Charax Spasinu was already a ghost, its empty buildings slowly being reclaimed by the humid air and encroaching silt. Today, its exact site is believed to lie beneath the shifting sediments of southern Iraq, a powerful symbol of a stark truth. Even our greatest engineering triumphs are temporary negotiations with a dynamic earth. We can divert a river, but we cannot stop the relentless geological processes that will, given enough time, reclaim their course. Charax represents the ultimate irony of human geography, a harbor that died not because we failed to control the water, but because our control could not last forever. But the sea does not always advance to claim a harbor. Sometimes it simply steps back, leaving a port stranded high and dry. This is the story of relative sea level fall, a geographical shift where the land rises or the water retreats, and a bustling waterfront becomes an inland relic. To witness this opposite fate, we must travel to the heart of a modern metropolis and dig beneath its streets, to the lost port of Roman London. When the Romans established Londinium around the year 43 AD, they chose their site with typical strategic brilliance at the first dependable crossing point on the River Thames. Here, the river was still tidal, yet narrow enough to bridge, and it provided a deep water anchorage for the supply ships that fueled the northern frontier of the empire. The Romans built a formidable waterfront of timber quays and warehouses along the north bank, a thriving commercial district that handled everything from Spanish olive oil to Gallic pottery. This was not a natural harbor in a bay, but a river port, its vitality entirely dependent on the Thames maintaining a certain depth and accessibility. For centuries, it served as a crucial node in the imperial network. Then, the world changed around it. In the centuries following the Roman withdrawal from Britain, the climate of the North Atlantic entered a cooler phase, often called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. Colder global temperatures meant more of the world's water was locked up in expanding glaciers and ice sheets. This caused eustatic sea level, the overall volume of ocean water, to drop. At the same time, another immense, slower process was at work across Britain. For thousands of years prior, the immense weight of glaciers during the last ice age had pressed down the landmass of Scotland and northern England. With the ice gone, the land began to slowly rebound, rising back up like a memory foam mattress, a process known as isostatic adjustment. This rebound was not uniform, it tilted the entire island. As the north rose, the south, including the London Basin, experienced a relative fall. The combined effect of a lower global sea level and this regional tilting meant that the Thames in London was no longer being pushed as high by the tides. The river's gradient steepened slightly, causing it to flow faster and cut down into its own bed. Over the course of several hundred years, the tidal head, the point where saltwater influence stops, moved steadily downstream. The Roman waterfront, engineered for a specific higher river level, found itself increasingly separated from the active channel. The once deep water anchorage grew shallower, becoming a muddy embankment. The great Roman quays were abandoned, left to rot and slowly collapse into the thickening silt at the river's new edge. As medieval London grew atop the Roman ruins, the old riverfront was forgotten, buried under centuries of rubbish, rebuilding, and landfill. The city expanded outward over the river using reclaimed land, pushing the effective shoreline farther south. What was once the heart of Roman commerce became the foundation for later streets and buildings. Today, archaeologists find the massive timber piles of Roman wharves and the remains of cargo ships not under the Thames, but buried deep beneath the financial district's modern streets, sometimes over 100 yards from the current riverbank. Walking through the City of London, you are literally strolling over a drowned harbour, a port that vanished not because the water rose, but because it quietly, permanently retreated. There is a harbour that vanished in a single, furious night, leaving behind only whispers of sin and a curse from the sea. On the wild North Sea coast, in the shallow waters now known as the Wadden Sea, lies the legend of Rungholt. Medieval chronicles tell of a fabulously wealthy trading town, a bustling port in the region of North Frisia, said to be so wicked and proud that its people mocked the church and lived in reckless luxury. Then, in January of 1362, a storm of biblical fury struck. A massive storm surge, what locals called the Great Drowning of Men, overwhelmed the coastal defenses. When the winds finally calmed and the waters receded, Rungholt was gone. Not damaged, not flooded, but erased. The entire town, its people, its ships, and its grand houses were swallowed by the sea, leaving no trace but the mournful cry of the wind over the mudflats. For centuries, Rungholt lived on as a cautionary folk tale, a mythical Atlantis of the north, a place punished for its hubris. But was it just a legend, or was there a terrifying geological truth behind the story of a harbor lost in one night? Modern archaeology and geology have begun to answer that question, revealing a tragedy not of divine punishment, but of a fragile landscape pushed past its breaking point. The truth is, Rungholt was real. It was not a solitary city, but part of a vast, settled marshland, a network of farming villages and trading ports built on a foundation of peat. This rich, waterlogged soil had been reclaimed from the sea by ingenious medieval engineers who built dikes and drainage systems to create fertile pasture and farmland. For a time, it worked brilliantly, creating wealth from the wetlands, but that success contained the seeds of disaster. Draining the peat had a catastrophic, unintended consequence. Peat is mostly water. When you drain it, the soil dries out, shrinks, and compacts. The very act of making the land livable and farmable caused the entire ground level to sink, a slow, relentless subsidence. Over generations, these reclaimed marshes, now sitting lower than the surrounding sea, became like a bowl waiting to be filled. The dikes that protected them had to be built ever higher, a constant battle against a rising water table from below and storm tides from the sea. The people of Rungholt were not necessarily more sinful than anyone else. They were living on a literal sinking fund, their prosperity making them increasingly vulnerable. When that colossal storm surge arrived in 1362, it did not strike a stable coastline. It hit a landscape that had been subtly, invisibly lowered by human hands. The dikes, stressed beyond their design, were simply overtopped and shattered. The water rushed into the sunken bowl of land with unimaginable force, not just flooding Rungholt, but permanently transforming the geography. What had been settled marsh became a new bay of the North Sea. The harbour and its world did not just flood. They were utterly dismantled and redistributed by the waves, buried under layers of sand and silt. Today, at extreme low tide, the ghostly outlines of this lost world sometimes appear. Researchers walking the vast mudflats have found the traces of drainage ditches, the foundations of house mounds, and even the worn ruts of cart tracks, all preserved in the compacted peat. These are the footprints of a landscape, not just a single town. The story of Rungholt is therefore a powerful fusion of the forces we have seen. It is a harbour lost to a sudden catastrophic event, the storm surge, but that catastrophe was made possible by the slow, human-accelerated subsidence of the land itself. It was a perfect storm of geography and activity, where the very techniques used to build a harbour and a community on the coast systematically undermined its future. The legend speaks of divine wrath, but the mud tells a more complex and humbling tale of a fragile partnership with a dynamic edge, where the margin for error, once crossed, was measured not in years but in the hours of a single terrible night. The silent stories of Ephesus and Alexandria are not locked in the past. They are blueprints for a pressing present. These ancient harbors teach us that the most significant threats to coastal cities are often the slow, cumulative ones, the forces that operate on a scale longer than political terms or economic cycles. Today, with the added pressure of human-driven climate change, the lessons etched in silt and submerged stone have never been more urgent. We are not merely observers of history. We are living in a chapter where these geological processes are accelerating. The patient accumulation of sediment, the sudden shudder of the earth, and the creeping advance of the sea are now compounded by a global rise in ocean levels and, in many places, by our own actions that worsen subsidence. Modern port cities stand on the front lines of this old, yet newly intensified, battle. Venice, that jewel of the Adriatic, faces a dual assault. The natural subsidence of its lagoon is amplified by the extraction of groundwater and natural gas from the deep earth beneath it, causing the entire city to sink faster. Meanwhile, global sea level rise pushes the waters of the Alta Aqua. The high water floods higher and more frequently into its historic squares. The city's monumental Moat barrier system is a direct descendant of the dredging projects at Ephesus, a colossal, modern attempt to hold back the inevitable tide, a technological response to a problem we have helped to accelerate. Further west, New Orleans tells a story frighteningly similar to that of Rungholt. Built on soft Mississippi River silt, much of the city is already below sea level. Its survival depends on a vast network of levees, pumps, and canals, an engineered landscape that, like the medieval Frisian marshes, is sinking because of drainage and soil compaction. The catastrophic failure of these defenses during Hurricane Katrina was a 21st century version of the Great Drowning of Men, a stark reminder that when we lower the land, we invite the sea in. And in Southeast Asia, Bangkok is sinking rapidly, not primarily from the sea, but from its own weight and the massive pumping of groundwater for its millions of residents. The city, built on a clay basin, subsides by over a centimeter a year while the Gulf of Thailand rises. The result is a city increasingly prone to devastating floods, its future viability dependent on stopping the pumping and managing the water in a way that acknowledges the ground's fragility. These modern parallels reveal a sobering pattern. The ancient forces of subsidence and sea level rise are now supercharged by industrialization and urbanization. We pump water and oil from the ground, causing it to compact. We pave over wetlands that once absorbed floodwaters. We build immense cities on deltas that are naturally soft and sinking, all while burning fuels that warm the planet and melt ice sheets, pouring more water into the oceans. The story of lost harbors shifts from a historical mystery to a contemporary warning. It tells us that the most durable cities will be those that learn to work with the dynamic nature of coastlines, rather than fighting a perpetual, exhausting war against them. This might mean managed retreat from the most vulnerable shores, the restoration of natural buffers like mangroves and marshes, and urban designs that accommodate occasional flooding rather than attempting to defy it at all costs. The mud that buried Miletus and the waves that drowned Rungholt are asking us a question not about the past but about the future we are now choosing to build. How will the great coastal cities of our era write their next chapter? And will they learn from the harbors that silence has already claimed? These three forces operate on vastly different clocks. Siltation is the slow, patient sculptor, working in increments of centuries, its progress measured in the subtle shallowing of a channel over a lifetime. An earthquake is the brutal editor, rewriting a coastline in minutes with a violent, decisive stroke. And the gradual migration of a shoreline is the grand, glacial director, shifting the entire stage over millennia, a movement so vast it feels like the background hum of the planet itself. One is a creeping suffocation, another a sudden amputation, and the third a slow, drifting apart. Their mechanisms could not be more distinct, from the gentle fall of a million grains of sand to the catastrophic lurch of tectonic plates. Yet their ultimate result is hauntingly identical, the severing of a city's vital, life-giving connection to the wider world. Whether the water retreats or the land rises, whether the harbor fills in or is swallowed whole, the outcome is a profound geographical isolation. The bustling wharf falls silent, the merchant's ledger closes, and the flow of ideas and goods that defined a civilization is cut off at its source. This is the shared fate of Ephesus, Port Royal, and the villages of Holderness, a shared story of being untethered. It forces a humbling reflection on the transience of our greatest works. The Pharaoh's lighthouse was a wonder of engineering, a beacon visible from 30 miles at sea. The artificial canals of Charax Spasinu were hydrological masterpieces. The dredging projects at Ephesus represented immense wealth and determination. Yet each in time was overwhelmed by planetary-scale processes that operate with an indifference to human ambition. These harbors are not monuments to failure, but to a fundamental truth: we build our cities on a dynamic earth, a partner that is always moving, always changing. The lost harbors are not ruins of defeat, but testaments to this enduring dialogue between human settlement and a restless planet. They remind us that our maps are temporary, and our greatest achievements are negotiations with forces that will ultimately outlast us all. Geography is not a fixed fate, but an ongoing conversation. The stories of these lost harbors reveal a profound truth about our place on this planet. We have seen three distinct ways that conversation can end: through the slow accumulation of silt, the sudden catastrophe of an earthquake, and the relentless, creeping change of a migrating coastline. Each force operates on its own timescale, from the patient work of a river over a millennium to the violent rewriting of a shore in minutes. Yet their outcome is always the same, severing the vital link between a community and the wider world, turning a gateway into a ghost. These are not just tales of ruin, but of resilience and adaptation, of the endless human attempt to find a foothold on the edge. The true wonder is that we can hear these conversations at all, centuries or even millennia after they fell silent. This is the work of the archaeological detective, piecing together clues from unlikely places. A core sample of mud extracted from a dry plain tells a story of deepening water followed by choking silt. A sonar scan over a calm bay reveals the ghostly grid of streets and the outlines of temples resting on the seabed. A medieval map, drawn with careful quill strokes, shows a headland or a village that the sea has long since consumed. These fragments are the puzzle pieces of lost worlds, allowing us to reconstruct not just the moment of loss, but the vibrant life that came before it. They transform legend into geography and myth into measurable history. This drive to build on the coast, to stake our future on the dynamic frontier between land and sea, speaks to something enduring in the human spirit. We are drawn to the horizon, to the promise of connection and discovery that only a harbor can offer. We build knowing on some level that our works are temporary, that the ground shifts and the tides turn. Yet we build anyway, creating monuments of commerce and culture in a negotiation with a partner that is forever changing. The lost harbors are not markers of our failure, but waypoints in that long, courageous dialogue. They remind us to listen to the land and the water, to build with humility, and to always respect the immense, patient forces that shape our world. If you know of a local story about a vanished shoreline or a forgotten port, share it in the comments below. Let's continue this exploration together, uncovering the quiet histories written in the landscape all around us.